Hi there, I'm Ian Grayling from the CETTa Academy. I wanted to put this video together because of a strong belief in the value of assessment for learning on the one hand, and on the other a concern that its purpose and process is often misunderstood. Now, I'm not going to be discussing summative assessment here other than to use it to illustrate what assessment for learning is not. Just to get us started, I will say the clue to understanding assessment for learning is in the word for. Also, I should say that some people will be more used to the term formative assessment. Personally, I prefer to talk about assessment for learning because that's exactly what it is. Let's start with how assessment for learning is often misunderstood. A lot of on-programme assessment looks like this. It starts with the learner journey, which could be any period of learning, as small as a single activity in a session, or as large as the learner's entire period on programme. Assessment, or more often testing, usually punctuates this journey at certain points along the way to check on learners' current attainment. This is actually assessment of learning, not for learning. And let me illustrate why the difference is so important. If learning has become blocked at some point along the way, how long will it be before you are able to realise this and can offer the learner help? Could a vacuum unwittingly reinforce disengagement and lack of self-sufficiency? When it comes to keeping the learner on track and moving forward, assessment of learning simply does not cut the mustard. It's also worth saying here that research tells us that repeated testing can impact quite badly on learner motivation and self-esteem. So let's have a look at assessment for learning. Assessment for learning is not bolted on, it's built into the learning. It is or should be an intrinsic part of the learning process. Further, it supports that learning process. Now, for a more challenging idea, assessment for learning is a teaching and learning strategy in itself, and the model I want to show you can even be called assessment as learning, but more of that later. One more characteristic, and this has important pedagogical consequences. Assessment for learning is a learner-led process. Now, I feel compelled at this point to warn you that I may now be preaching sedition. What I have to say about real assessment for learning could change the whole way you think about teaching and learning, and some of you may find that what you were taught during initial teacher ed is now being challenged. However, that said, let's continue. Let's start to look at the processes within assessment for learning, which runs in parallel to the process of learning. And I want to emphasise the first step. Monitoring may seem so obvious as to not warrant discussion. However, can you always know that every learner is actually engaging with the learning activity? No engagement means no learning. No engagement and the whole learning process collapses. That's how crucial it is. And it's not surprising that Ofsted want to be certain that all the learners in a group are actively engaged in learning. Okay, evaluation. Evaluation is not so much about wanting to know that learning is happening. It's more about wanting to know how the learning is proceeding, how the learners are getting on. Are they getting on, or indeed are they getting stuck somewhere? So it's that process of making sure that we know when a learner is getting blocked, when it happens, not a day later or a week later, even longer. So reviewing. Reviewing is the process of taking stock of the accuracy of the learner's process, the accuracy of the learner's understanding of what they're learning. It's about supporting any issues that have risen during learning, and it's about reinforcing, validating the progress that has been made. Now, goal setting naturally flows from this when we agree what the next steps need to be, and it's important in the assessment for learning model of this, that goals are set which actually motivate the learners, and a lot of that is to do whether it is meaningful in relation to real work and real life. Now, here we have it then. I'm putting this together now into what I call a process model of assessment and tracking. So what we've done with this is we've combined assessment for learning and assessment as learning. You will also see that I've introduced tracking into the model and also apportion responsibilities for different parts of the process. And note that the processes of monitoring, evaluation and tracking sit at the heart of this model and are learner-led. I would like to start by looking at this. Teachers need a simple method to know that every learner is engaging and getting on with the agreed learning activity. Requiring learners to monitor and evaluate their learning in real time is simply the best way to do this. After all, teachers don't have the time to do this on a one-to-one basis with every learner in a large group. I guess you might be thinking, how can I get my learners to do this and record it in some sort of tracking document? Are they even capable? And they will be great questions, and I'm glad that you've asked them. Research tells us that even quite young children are capable of monitoring and evaluating their own learning process. However, let me go back and say that last bit again. We are asking them to monitor and evaluate their learning process, not the quality of their subject expertise. That's the teacher's, the subject expert's job. And that's what makes the difference between assessment for learning and assessment of learning. Now, learners are not daft. They're not going to do this without a bit of a fight, which is why this needs to be a requirement. It needs to be non-negotiable, set out in the learner's contract and reinforced by everyone. And just in case you might be thinking that I'm being a little harsh on them, psychologists tell us that this process amounts to metacognition, in which learners don't just learn something, they also critically reflect on what and how they are learning it. Does that sound familiar? Critical reflection? And this is known to improve learning outcomes. And there's more. There is no place to hide either an unwillingness or an inability to engage. The process of recording their monitoring and evaluation in a tracking document simply makes that impossible. Further, real-time tracked monitoring and evaluation of learning gives the teacher a reliable and diagnostic insight, yes, a diagnostic insight into the knowledge and skills that are being acquired. And this can be easily rag rated at the review stage for accurate and highly current management information system purposes, whole organisational performance, if you like. The teacher's ability to access a reliable record of process enables reviewing to take place very quickly in minutes or even seconds, and it is more focused. And it's interesting to note that a lot of what passes for reviews in education is more often an unreliable attempt to monitor and evaluate retrospectively through the fog of time. So you will be getting the message that learner-led monitoring and evaluation and tracking is a good thing. But let's make it fun as well. Get them to design their own. Could there be a role for mobile and digital technologies here? Gosh, I almost forgot. Isn't this also about creating a meaningful, living and evolving ILP? But let's call that something else, as it reminds me of the dead and bureaucratic documents that often go by that name. I've talked a lot about the learner's role in assessment. Teachers do have a role too, namely reviewing and goal setting. Reviewing means looking back at things and happens when the teacher uses their subject expertise to check the learning process, which, as we know, can only happen if the monitoring and evaluation has already been tracked and is there to be examined. Goal setting emerges naturally from the review. Now, forget academic distinctions between aims and objectives. Learners don't care about them in the slightest, and the same applies to SMART targets. Goals are motivational as well as directional tools and need to appeal to the learner's values and sense of purpose. This warrants a more detailed look, and it's also where the dual professional expertise of the teacher really kicks in. Learners need to know and understand their learning goals. Flashing aims and objectives up on a PowerPoint is sadly pretty meaningless and ineffective. As dual professionals, teachers must be capable of explaining why a learning goal is important, what's its purpose, or what use does it serve, how does it fit into the larger learning journey. I would argue that not one of us would make anything like a real effort if we could not satisfy those particular questions. Learning is about hearts as well as minds. If you want to motivate me, then goals need to be current for me. I need to see that they are relevant to me now, not at some nebulous point in the future. There's lots of research to substantiate that. I can cope with a goal that isn't immediately relevant as long as I can see that it is a stepping stone to something which I do value. I'm also more likely to be motivated by goals that make me feel good about myself. And very important, if you give me a goal which I don't feel is achievable for me, then I'm easily demotivated and going to disengage from that. So I need to make sure that if it's not achievable, I can break it down into smaller steps. So we're talking about the skills of psychology, or might I say actually the skills of teaching. It's that bit of teaching which is generic teaching skill rather than subject specific skill. So I've presented a model here. We have more recently called it Reimagining Assessment and Tracking. I'm going to leave it to you to decide whether you feel that it is a paradigm shift. I would argue that assessment and tracking has up until now been largely unexamined assumptions. Research carried out by CETTa Academy and many others on behalf of the Education and Training Foundation suggest that we need to reimagine both of these things, assessment and tracking. Our research has further highlighted a lack of linguistic precision that creates confusion. For example, and from a perspective of this assessment for learning or assessment and tracking model, right? What is the difference between formative and diagnostic assessment? Because it's getting very vague to us. Yeah, it seems to us, to myself and my partners, that this is getting rather blurred, and it's really the same thing. What about initial assessment? Well, is initial assessment in terms of this model really initial assessment? I would argue that it's initial review and goal setting. Okay, you might back it up or validate it, if you like, by some additional testing. However, I would like to think that you would achieve that rather with some additional assessment and tracking, assessment for learning, rather than bombard the learner with a lot of testing right at the beginning of their learner journey, their new learner journey. Okay, so there we have it. I hope I've presented something which is intelligible. You can understand our reasons for promoting this model. We certainly welcome hearing from you if you would either like further explanation about this or to argue some of the concepts. It's evolving. We need debate around these issues. We've simply got to avoid becoming ossified in constructs which are no longer applicable within the sector. So on that note, I'm going to thank you for listening and wish you all the best.